Hello and welcome to South2North, coming to you from Johannesburg, South Africa. With all the wars around today that we know about, there's one that you can't see, you can't hear it, and it doesn't involve guns and bullets. But its effects can be just as dangerous to the world we live in. They call it cyberwar. So what is it and what makes it so dangerous? It's not just those email scams promising you millions of dollars if you only send your bank details. No, the real stuff puts whole countries at risk. Who are the criminals? And what are the issues shaping the future of the world of cybersecurity? Well, joining us from London, we have Misha Glenny, cybercrime expert and author of Dark Market, How Hackers Became the New Mafia. And in the studio tonight, Haroon Mir, who runs Thinkst Applied Research. And later, we are joined by Stila van Eerden, a hacker famous for hacking into the Johannesburg Stock Exchange, who has now gone straight and working as an information security analyst. Good morning to you, Misha. Welcome to South2North.
Good morning.
Let's start with the definition of cybercrime. What are we talking about? What is cybercrime?
Many people mistake what I call cyber-assisted crime for actual cybercrime. And cyber-assisted crime is simply when people engaged in normal crime use computers to make their work more efficient and on a broader scale. Cybercrime itself is when people actually hack into computer systems and then use the inside knowledge that cracking into the system allows them in order to get financial or commercial gain.
All right, Misha, let us into that dark world, those of us who've never been in it. What were some of the most astounding findings you found while you were doing your research?
Cybercrime, unlike traditional organized crime, does not require the ability of those perpetrating it to threaten or to deploy violence. So it's a crime without violence, which, in one respect is a very good thing. What that means is that the people who engage in cybercrime have a very different social and psychological profile than those who are involved in traditional organized crime. And this is where we have the nerds who have fantastic computer skills and can do amazing things on computers, but are perhaps less well equipped to deal with the real world. This is when they come into their own. It's perpetrated by people, not necessarily with great computer skills, called social engineers, who persuade you to do things with your computer which you will eventually end up regretting doing.
And what about the different regions of the world? Is cybercrime different in the global south compared with the developed world?
Certainly, the early incubators of cybercrime tended to be in the BRIC countries. There are specific social and economic reasons as to why they emerged in the BRIC countries, to do with the residual good education for middle and lower middle classes, but with poor access of young people to employment and to consumer goods. And they found that using computers, they could access money and they could access goods much quicker than they ever could in the real world. And of course, it also testified to their entrepreneurial spirit.
But what about legislation? Are there tighter controls in other parts of the world?
Legislation is fairly chaotic. Different countries have very different laws, and cyber criminals generally keep abreast of some of the laws. So one of the hackers I met when I was researching the book, Dark Market, he was a very enterprising guy. Wasn't a computer specialist himself, but understood how you could use computers in order to perpetrate debit and credit card fraud, and he had done a lot of it. And so he explained to me that he simply never would scam American cards because US law enforcement agencies, the FBI and the Secret Service, have what you call an extraterritorial jurisdiction, that they arrogate the right to themselves to go after people in countries outside of the United States, and that's written into their cyber legislation. Not many countries have that. This is a legal cacophony, I have to say, around the world. Nobody really knows who is allowed to do what, where, in what country, and why.
It sounds like it, and I think the name of your book is quite apt in describing that. So what was dark market? What was that about?
Oh, Dark Market was a marvellous thing. It was a website called www.darkmarket.com, which was it was a forum where cyber criminals could come and meet, shoot the breeze, chat about, you know, how they could steal debit and credit cards, how they could download the latest viruses and deploy them. They could read online tutorials about committing the latest cybercrime. And it was a very lively operation. It was, however, it had 5 administrators, and one of those administrators was an undercover agent of the FBI. So one of the fascinating things I discovered when researching Dark Market is not only were the FBI and other law enforcement agencies present, but there were also a large number of intelligence agencies present on Dark Market trying to ascertain what the latest techniques were for committing cybercrime, because they felt that they would see them further down the road in matters of national security and commercial espionage, but also they wanted to see whether people they considered members of terror organizations were using credit and debit card fraud as a way of financing their activities. Some countries are beginning to introduce laws which are draconian, and they fear go beyond the aim of trying to track down cyber criminals and start moving into the sphere of privacy issues. And that, I mean, in the United Kingdom here at the moment, for example, we've got a big kerfuffle going on, a big debate about whether to pass a data communications bill, which, if it became law, would basically give the government the right to monitor more or less any email or internet communication that anyone undertakes at any point at any time in this country. And there are real concerns that this might be going a step too far.
All right, so talking about the world of cybersecurity, or the business of cybersecurity, stay with us, Misha. Our next guest feels very strongly about that. You are in the business. Haroon Meer is based in Doha, but joins us in Johannesburg today. So let's talk about this. How big a business is it?
The tech business or the defense business?
The defense business.
So I think the defense business, like Misha says, is big and growing, but in truth, it's still really young. So you've got lots of companies out there selling product, selling services, and so far we're not truly convincing that buying their services are able to solve the problem.
Why? Is it because the cyber criminals are always 10 steps ahead of everyone else?
So it would be an easy narrative to say there were these young wonder kids that were ahead of everyone.
That's what I think.
In truth, it's more just because technology is new to us. So it's a pretty philosophical answer. But in truth, technology is a force multiplier. But the same thing works when it works against us. So a small group of people can do incredible harm, even though they're just a small group, because of the force of technology.
All right, so we spoke about defense, but what exactly is a cyber war attack? What does it entail?
It's murky right now because people get hung up on our traditional views of war. And so the moment you talk cyber war, you imagine rows of soldiers behind computers saying, okay, fire, and launching an attack, where most of the things that have touched on cyber war today cut much closer to traditional espionage. Certainly the biggest example to date has been the Stuxnet attack, where it's widely accepted that a combined Israeli-US force put together this worm that attacked Iranian nuclear centrifuges. And so far, because details on this are kind of sketchy all over, it's said to have held the Iran's nuclear plans back 2 years. But essentially what you had was, if you looked at it simply, a worm that was deployed, jumped through some technical hoops, and could have caused a nuclear meltdown in Iran.
The irony of it, though, is that the United States accused China of state-sponsored cyber war attacks. What was that about?
Yeah, so recently there have been a lot of saber rattling around cyber war. The US has come out very strongly calling out China for cyber war, and currently there's talk that Iranians are attacking nuclear energy plants in the US. In the Iranian case, if I was an Iranian working for the government, now would not be the time to poke the bear. Like the last thing you want to do is get the US into war. In terms of China, there certainly is a lot of activity coming out of China in the same way Misha points out that you get it in the BRIC nations. But to make the jump to call it state-sponsored cyber war attacks is probably taking it a little bit far, certainly with the evidence that I've seen so far. And in all these cases, we have to ask ourselves who profits from the information being out there. So there's this burgeoning cyber defense market. All the old players in the military-industrial complex now figure out that instead of selling missiles for hundreds of thousands that cost hundreds of thousands to build, you can sell code for hundreds of thousands that costs you much less to build.
Is data now the new oil?
Oh, well, it's certainly the new gold rush. Everybody wants to play in there. And so again, it puts you in this dangerous spot where there certainly is a threat and there certainly is work to be done. But there's certainly lots of people who profit from making us all scared of the threat. And so it's really hard to draw the line between what's traditionally called FUD, fear, uncertainty, and doubt, and what's real and what needs acting on.
Now, Misha talked about the chaotic space in the legislative process. Now, all these countries, the United States, Israel, are accusing each other of cyber attacks. Does that then empower them to come up with legislation? Are we about to see control of the cyberspace?
I think there's an increasing rush to militarize cyberspace, which scares people like me a lot because it's our internet and it's getting taken away by the politicians and the warmongers. In terms of legislation, it's always going to be a tough space. I think the old Greek guy said best when he said the justice is only in question amongst people of equals because the strong do what they will and the weak endure what they must. And I think we see the same thing coming through in cyberspace. So you see the big nations saber-rattling, saying we'd go after you with kinetic force if you attack us. But at the same time, the biggest attributed cyber attacks have come from these developed nations.
In which countries are we likely to see legislation soon?
So I think most countries are starting to align their legislation, at least for local hacks. So in the States, you're starting to see draconian punishments, as Misha said. The guys in Russia and the guys in the Ukraine pretty much have a get-out-of-jail-free card as long as they don't attack local businesses. And there's arguments that the same thing's happening in China, that China is such a tightly controlled network with so much activity coming out of it, it must be state-sanctioned. But in truth, I don't see anyone solving the problem anytime soon.
Are there unique challenges facing, I asked Misha that question earlier, unique challenges that we face as this part of the world, the global south, in terms of cybersecurity?
For sure we do. One of the problems is I think we're just starting to realize that when you're on the internet, you're milliseconds away from people who really want to hurt you.
Don't frighten me.
Well, it's true, and I think largely the way we've been thinking about things geographically will have to disappear. Like if we consider people attacking the US stock exchange, why attack the US stock exchange when you can attack South Africa's?
So, Misha, let me bring you in here. Where should we be looking for the world's cyber criminals? Where should we be searching?
Well, you know, how long is a piece of string? There is considerable fear, if you talk to law enforcement officers in the United States, that Kenya in particular, with its advanced capacity for the use of mobile phones, is going to be the next wave of, the next sort of center of crimes, because a lot of people don't even realize that smartphones aren't phones, they're computers. And the number of people who download antivirus software onto their Android-driven phones, for example, is really minimal compared to the amount of people who download that software onto their ordinary computers. So a lot of people are walking around with phones that are extremely vulnerable. Law enforcement agencies are concerned that there's going to be a new wave of attacks on smartphones.
So Misha, how do we maintain our online liberties without jeopardizing our own safety? How do we protect ourselves?
You know, this conundrum is as old as the hills, the difficult balance between freedom and security requires people to begin to understand at the level of school children, I would say, that cybersecurity is something that we have to take a personal responsibility for, and we have to know how to reduce our risk when we're using computers. If a hacker wants to go after you, Redi, specifically, and they've decided that you're who they want, there's nothing you can do about it, frankly.
Oh,
but
no.
it's very unlikely that they would, unless you'd really upset somebody.
Harun, I can tell that you're not a fan of legislation. Same question to you. How do we protect ourselves?
We shouldn't rush into over-legislation, and we certainly shouldn't rush into over-surveillance.
I agree.
So just like there's this powerful emerging digital industrial complex, there's a really strong push for increased surveillance. But the old Ben Frank quote that says, those who would trade a little bit of essential liberty for temporary security deserve neither liberty nor security, I think holds very well here. I think one of the things we have to make sure is that we don't give away the internet as we know it in the hopes that that can protect us, because it can't.
All right, well, it certainly didn't protect some from my next guest. Stila van Eerden is a reformed hacker, best known for hacking into the Johannesburg Stock Exchange. Today, he's the Director of Information Security Services at Exactech. He joins us now. Are you a reformed hacker? I want to be sure before we even start this conversation.
Most definitely.
Okay, so tell me about it. How did you become a hacker?
I'm from a small town up north in South Africa called Polokwane, and they say strange things happen in small towns. And I guess that's exactly what happened to me. At a young age, I was very interested in computers. And my dad bought me an Amiga computer. At that stage, it was used, it was a very specialist computer, and it was different from your normal PC, different from your DOS-based or Windows-based PC. And I had to get software for it. So we found a way to make free phone calls overseas. And that's where the interest started. Started getting familiar, once you can make free phone calls, what else can you do?
Okay, so why the JSE? I mean, a while back, your handle, your name was Actor.
Just perhaps some reasoning behind the name Actor. Misha and Harun referred to social engineering, basically pretending to be somebody that you're not. And I thought, you know what, I could exploit this, and that's why I chose the handle. And at a time, as I grew out of, just playing around, I realized I could make a business out of this. And I had a dream, I realized I saw myself actually getting on an airplane and traveling overseas and advising companies in information security. So I thought, perhaps if I break into the Johannesburg Stock Exchange and leave a message that I was looking for a job in information security, somebody out there would listen. And exactly that happened. Ernst & Young employed me in the year 2000.
Big international company.
Big international
So was it
company.
just about business, or was there a part of you, Stila, that wanted to humiliate these companies and show them who's powerful?
I was very immature at that stage. That was 13 years ago. And I would say that there was an element of that, we're young, look at what we can do. But ultimately, I realized, I'm growing out of this. I need to make a career out of it. That dream came in fulfillment when, at the age of 19, I got to my first overseas trip to Abu Dhabi in the United Arab Emirates. And I assisted a bank with their internet banking platform.
Misha, does Stila fit your profile, as per your book, the profile of a cyber criminal?
Stella has made some very important points here. When people start developing these skills, usually young boys, in my experience about 95% of hackers are male, they're often between the ages of sort of 13, 14, 15 years old. And they haven't, as he was emphasizing then, they haven't fully developed their moral and social compass. They're very enthusiastic, they're excited to explore, they want to show off their exploits as well. And I think it's dangerous, which tends to happen with some of the draconian legislation that Harun was referring to basically cast these kids aside as dangerous hackers who belong in jail, because I think that actually they have tremendous skills and abilities which are of great value for society.
Stila, do you think what you did was unethical or criminal?
South Africa didn't have any legislation back then to fight cybercrime. And I
You
thought,
wouldn't have known if there was. You were very young, weren't you?
I actually kept tabs on it. I wanted to know what I was letting myself into.
I'm very afraid to ask you legal questions. You've made it clear you don't like legislation.
Like
but was it unethical? What do you think?
I think if we arrested everyone, Steve Jobs and Wozniak, who famously sold blue boxes, which effectively allow you to make free phone calls on their campus during their campus days, would have been thrown in jail, and we wouldn't have had Apple Computer. So I think there's clearly a wealth of resources that we shouldn't just be tossing aside.
Misha, tell me, why is there an absence of women in this space? I've never heard of a female cyber criminal. I may be the first, but I've never heard of women. Why?
I met about 20 to 25 people who were actively involved in cybercrime when I was researching dark market, and I worked really hard to try and find a female criminal hacker, and I'm afraid I've failed. But the time has come to start researching into the social and psychological characteristics of people who are good at hacking. But 95% male hackers is statistically very significant. I would aver that there is some anecdotal evidence suggesting that people who are somewhere along the line of what we refer to as spectrum disorders sometimes have more advanced hacking ability than those who aren't on spectrum disorder. But this is a very controversial area, but we need to do research on it. At the moment, all the money in cybersecurity is going into high-end digital products which make companies an absolute fortune. There is virtually no money being going into researching into hackers, what their motivations are, what their abilities are, what their social backgrounds are, and so on and so forth. And I think it's high time that we started looking at that and started to understand the human dimension of what goes on in cybercrime and cyber espionage and so on.
What is the way forward? What must companies then do? We spoke about individuals, and Misha, you told us our responsibility to ourselves. But companies?
It's interesting. Something that Misha said in terms of understanding the attackers is actually a growing trend in cybersecurity, even on the defensive side right now, where people are figuring out that if you've got company X, to just say we want to be secure is not sufficient. And there's a growing body of research for understanding your possible adversary. Because if you say you just want to protect against your garden variety kids, this is what you need. If you're running the sort of business that's likely to be targeted by nation states, this is what you need. One of the things I'll say is we've made a mistake in kind of blurring those lines. So making everyone think that they needed to worry about security the same amount. And the danger that you have is people who shouldn't be spending quite as much time worried about security do, and people who really do don't know that they should.
Misha, I see you nodding, and you've really frightened me to death. So what can Redi do to protect herself? Must I get rid of all my credit cards, my bank cards, my cell phone, my computer? That's it. None of that for me. Am I safe?
No. Much of what you do on the internet is perfectly safe, and of course, as we know, if your credit card is compromised, then usually the bank will pay you back. Haroon makes a really important point about the data that you don't need to have on a computer store somewhere else. Your data is much more open to the outside world that you might imagine. So don't write anything on a computer. Don't certainly write anything on an email that you may regret seeing on the front page of a tabloid newspaper the next day.
Haroon, you've told us how we can protect ourselves, but I'd like to hear from a former hacker himself.
I would like to quote Sun Tzu, says, "Know that you'll be attacked, just be prepared for when that happens." And it comes down to awareness.
Well, I'm far more educated than I was before we started this conversation. Misha Dleni, thank you very much for joining us and sharing your insights. Really, really fascinating world. Thanks indeed.
You're welcome.
Haroon Meer, thank you for joining us as well. And I hope that for your sake, there will be no legislation. And Stila van Eerden, thank you so much for joining us. Thanks for joining me on South to North. And remember this, cyber criminals are experts, so don't try this at home. You can tweet your questions, comments, and opinions to @AJ South2North or find us on Facebook. See you next week. Bye-bye.